Many of of Plato's dialogues begin or part important speeches and then begin with an invocation of one of the gods. So I'd like to start by invoking, I think appropriately for this talk, Hermes, to allow some wisdom to arise from us all being together in this room. And why don't we take a few minutes to just close our eyes and arrive here and find our way to this place and this time. I'll sit down on this cushion and just relax for a bit. Okay, whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes. So, as some of you may have seen in my Facebook invite, there have been lots of different stories about the history of the tarot over the years, including the account by a man named Jean-Baptiste Alliette, writing under the pseudonym Etela. And he said that the tarot was created by a group of Egyptian sages under the tutelage of Hermes Trismegistus in the year something like 2150 BC. He put the precise year, I don't know how he knew it, because he didn't, he made it up. But the question I'm starting with is, why did these people come up with these extravagant stories about where the tarot came from? And to answer that question, we can look at another major writer on the tarot, really the first writer on the tarot as a tool for occultism.
Okay. Thank you.
And that was Court de Gebelin. You can enjoy me butchering French for much of the night because there's a lot of French people involved in this history and I don't know how to pronounce it. All right, so so this was the first writing on the occult tarot, and it was part of a work called Le Monde Primitif, which means the primitive world. But when he used the word primitive, he didn't mean like old and crappy, He meant that the primitive world he was talking about was the golden age, where all of the knowledge, all human knowledge was present. Everyone spoke the same language. It was the time that where the one true religion was practiced that all of the current religions are sort of bastard children of. And this was his idea of history. So this theory of history has a big part to play in the history of tarot. So we can look at, we want to figure out what our theory of history is here. And we can talk about history as just a whole bunch of events in linear sequence, little events. But that doesn't really capture what we mean by history. But you'll see the handout is a timeline of events. So that's kind of like this version of history. But if I just gave you this and recited it to you, you probably wouldn't be satisfied with this talk. So history doesn't just mean events. It also, where did I put that marker? We also need to give some meaning to those events. If you read a book of history, you want it to create some kind of meaning out of all this series of events. So you do that by finding patterns. This event is kind of like that event. And this sequence of events is kind of like that sequence of events. But even then, just simply listing patterns isn't quite fully what we mean by history or by meaning. In order to have meaning, you need to say why those events are important. In order to do that, you need values. Some sense of what is important and why. So then when you have a series of events that you're demonstrating patterns based on some set of values, then we kind of call that history, or a story. History just means story in whatever language it comes from. Yeah, I mean, any Romance language, historia in Spanish is story or history. But for the purpose of this talk, there's a further level that I want to bring in, which is where do the values come from? And my personal, let's get into meta-ethics for a minute. I would say that values arise from our relationship to unity. All values arise from love, and those of you who study the Kabbalah or Gematria know that the word for love and the word for unity have the same numeric value in Hebrew. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you contemplate that, love arises from our identification with other people and other parts of creation, that we are all ultimately one thing. So we could also say that this up here, so this is unity. We also might call it eternity. This is those truths that exist outside of time. So a fairly quotidian example would be 3 + 3 = 6. That is something that we can discover to be true at any point in time, and it doesn't matter what language you speak. That sort of concept is discoverable by any intelligent being. Even on another planet, 3 + 3 still equals 6. If this universe were just destroyed and a new universe created, if beings arose in that universe that could cognize the way we do, they would discover that 3 + 3 = 6. But I think there's more interesting things in this realm of eternity as well. But I would say that history really is relating eternity to time. And people like Corte Gebelin, with his Monde Primitif, the way he related eternity to time is to say that those things that reside in eternity all existed at some point in the distant past. And I think this is a basic sort of confusion that is going to arise over and over in our exploration of the history of Tarot. This idea that eternity is something really old. But it's not. It's something, so the term primordial is a good way to look at this. Does primordial mean the first event, or does it mean of the first order? So I'm going to argue, so the Corte Gebelin and other people that we'll encounter said that the closest point of time in time to eternity is the past. There are other people who say the closest point in time to eternity is the future, that we're in this progressive development that is leading to some sort of grand culmination, some New Jerusalem, or there's many examples in different, the United Federation of Planets in Star Trek, But I'm going to argue that the closest point in time to eternity is right now. The shortest line that you can draw from a point to another line is the one that is perpendicular. And we actually find this symbol in the Tarot. So this whole conception I was able to arrive at this partly through having contemplated these symbols and through reading books because this is similar to other schemes that we could create on this same symbol. So, for example, in the book Meditations on the Tarot, he talks about 4 kinds of knowledge or experience. So up here, this would be mysticism. And this would be Gnosis. This is magic, and this is Hermetic philosophy. These are 4 different ways of knowing. Mysticism being the experience of unity with the all. Gnosis being the ideas that arise in us out of those mystical experiences. Magic being applying that gnosis to create change in the world. And Hermetic philosophy being what we're trying to do here, which is taking all of that and creating sort of a system of knowledge based on it. So what I've demonstrated here is that the Tarot definitely can be a source of gnosis. That knowledge can be derived in the present moment from the contemplation of the Tarot cards. That's not in question. What's in question is, where did the Tarot cards come from? And who came up with what ideas, which is all this stuff here. All right, so let's get into that. So what's kind of odd is that the writers on the history of the Tarot haven't really accounted very well for the fact that study of it is capable of generating gnosis at any point in history. There's kind of been 2 approaches to the history of Tarot. There's been the people who have worked with it and recognized its power, but wanted to say that all of the knowledge that comes from it came from some point way far in the past and was put there by some people that we just have to get it back out. And on the other hand, there's historians who said, well, those people who said that obviously didn't know what they were talking about because the documentary evidence doesn't support it. So therefore, it's just a bunch of people making stuff up. And there's all these gaps in the tradition. But what I want to say is that there's gaps and continuity, and that's a good thing. Without the gaps, there's no room for gnosis to enter. If there was actually a tradition that was created in Egypt and hadn't handed down verbatim by secret societies until today, I wouldn't trust it, because then there's no room for new knowledge to enter anywhere along that train. Doctrines that are handed down verbatim are kind of like what they have in the Catholic Church. Which there's a lot of good stuff in the Catholic Church, but dogma isn't necessarily the best way of approaching religious experience, I don't think. So, basic outline of the history that we're going to go through. First, we're going to talk about ancient Alexandria.
Can you write a little bigger?
Okay. Ancient Alexandria, which I'm going to call the birthplace of Hermeticism, although in the words of Semisonic, every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. So there's not really an origin point that you can really pick for anything. But we can talk about that. Then we're going to go to Renaissance Italy. Put too many N's. Renaissance, where the Tarot was created. And then we'll go to 18th to 19th century France. Which is where the first occult theories of the Tarot were written down. And then we'll look at England around the turn of the last century, where the French theories were sort of brought into English, and Tarot was brought into the English-speaking world, and also the process of systematizing the relationship with Tarot and occultism really was kind of culminated. So, Hermeticism. Hermeticism is a sort of body of philosophy and religious thought that arose in ancient Alexandria between about a century BC and 2 or 3 centuries AD. And it arose out of, well, let's rewind a little bit. So Socrates taught Plato, or rather wandered around Athens pestering people, and including Plato. And then Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander. Alexander decided he wasn't so much for the teaching thing and conquered most of the world. Not really most of the world, but most of the Mediterranean basin and into India. And then, as soon as he was done conquering, he died. And his generals split up his empire over dinner, where by dinner I mean killing a lot of people. I looked it up today. It was pretty brutal. Yeah, you don't want to know. There was like family killing family and mass executions. And if you want your children to live a long and happy life, don't start an empire. Okay, so his generals split it up. One of his generals was Ptolemy, and he got Alexandria, he got Egypt. And he built the city of Alexandria in Egypt in honor of Alexander. So this was a period when the Greeks had conquered Egypt. And so there was a lot of mixing of Greek ideas and Egyptian ideas. And that's where Hermeticism came from. So that I'm defining Hermeticism as that mixture of Greek and Egyptian ideas, which is why I say it originated in Alexandria. Obviously, the ideas went back further into Greece and into Egypt. So the basic premises of Hermeticism are there are various levels or planes of being. So that's what we have here. This is basically a Hermetic diagram. Now you can subdivide these levels of being into as many subdivisions as you want. I don't know if we have the Constitution of Man around here, but anyway, there's a system that we use a lot here that has 49 subdivisions, or it's 7 planes with 7 divisions each. The Tarot also is a system like this, and we'll get into that when we get to Tarot. So there are various levels or planes of being. That's the first precept of Hermetic philosophy. Culminating with some version of God. Often God is simply unity in this tradition, but there's different conceptions of God that can be, I would say, included in Hermeticism. And another fundamental precept is that an important aspect of God is mind. And then the last one is that it is possible through some form of mental discipline and sometimes ritual to bring one's own mind into closer contact with the divine mind. And that's where we get this idea of gnosis. So we have this it's called Hermeticism because a lot of the works that were written in this milieu of ancient Alexandria were attributed to someone named Hermes Trismegistus. And Hermes Trismegistus was the equation of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, basically bringing these two figures together, saying they're really the same figure. Now, some of the writings seem to indicate that people thought this was an actual guy who lived a long time ago, but I think it's an equally, or one other interpretation, which I haven't done enough reading of the Hermetic corpus to see how well it is supported, but I would say that Hermes is this principle of mediation between the eternal and the temporal, which is mind. One name for that would be mind. We are able, through our minds, to cognize things in this temporal realm and things in the eternal realm. So I would say that the interpretation that I would like to use for who Hermes Trismegistus is he is that psychopomp. You know, Hermes is the messenger of the gods. He's the god who doesn't have a particular realm of being that's his, like Zeus has the sky and Hades has Hades. Hermes' proper realm is all of them, everywhere, all over the place. He's the principle of mediation. So that's what I would say where Hermeticism originates, and that's, I would say, any philosophy that has this idea of levels of being and this idea of gnosis could be considered Hermetic. So then this philosophy was carried on by some thinkers that have become to be known as Neoplatonists. And that would be Plotinus, that says Porphyry. Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Proclus. Now this term Neoplatonism didn't arise until the 19th century, but it's sort of an arbitrary demarcation of these thinkers. But what they did is they took this Hermetic philosophy and they were the sort of conduit for Hermetic philosophy into the Western world. The Hermetic corpus was lost for a long time in Western Europe, but some of the writings of some of these thinkers did make it into Latin at various points, and also into the thinking of the Latin Church Fathers. And the reason I bring up Neoplatonism is because these thinkers, this tradition of Neoplatonism, influenced the early Italian Renaissance. Whereas the Corpus Hermeticum itself, the writings attributed to Hermes, didn't make it into Renaissance Italy until a bit later.
Greek.
Yeah, so this is all written in Greek. And in Western Europe, after about 500 AD, not very many people spoke Greek. So if it wasn't in Latin, people didn't know about it. And that included most of Plato's writings and many of Aristotle's writings.
What about the Emerald Tablets?
So the Emerald Tablet, the first mention of that is by an Arabian alchemist in, I think, around 6-something AD. And he said, I forget where he said he found it, but it's not really sure where that came from. If it, came, yeah, it wasn't. It's not part of the Hermetic corpus that we now have from ancient Alexandria.
Well, it's published and everything, you can get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it has been included in some later editions of the Corpus Hermeticum, but we don't have any extant copies that date back to Alexandria. So we don't know exactly where that came in, but it's been included, it's attributed to Hermes, and it's been included in the corpus, and it's definitely expresses Hermetic philosophy, as above, so below, and it definitely can give rise to Gnosis. So there's no reason why we shouldn't make use of it. So yeah, that's kind of where it comes into the course of events. But then how we use it is more related to this. So Italy, Renaissance Italy, that's where we were. So in Renaissance Italy, there was a resurgence of interest in and availability of classical philosophy. So Plato, Aristotle, and at some point the Corpus Hermeticum. In 1204, there was a sack of Constantinople by Western Crusaders. At that point, a lot of Greek speakers and Greek speakers from Byzantium, from the Eastern Roman Empire, came to the West, and so we started to get more knowledge of Greek. So more of these Greek texts started to be translated, and then by the 14th century, or the 14th and 15th century, there was a real resurgence of this kind of knowledge. And this is kind of where Tarot comes in. So the earliest, if you look at your timeline, the earliest mention of Trionfi, which is the Italian name for the Tarot, means triumphs. The first of Carta da Trionfi, the first mention of that is in 1442. And the earliest tarot decks that we have are around 1440, 1450. So it was invented at some point before that, but not too far before that, because cards didn't come to Europe until the first mention of them was 1367. So first you get playing cards, which did come from Egypt, but from a much later time in Egypt, the Mamluk Empire. And then in Italy, the 22 trumps, or we don't know how many trumps, the trump cards of the tarot, like this one, were added to the playing card deck. And that's what we would call the origin of tarot. Now, it's some question, what do you want to call the origin of tarot? Because a little bit earlier, there was a deck of playing cards with 16 figures of gods added to it. If you want to call that tarot or not. But it's clear that there was sort of a development of this game, this trick-taking game. So tarot was invented as a game where you take tricks, kind of like bridge, and the trumps are used to they're trumps. They take all the other cards that aren't trumps, and they have an order to them. Now, this idea of triumphs comes from from Italian culture at the time, where there were parades called triumphs, where there were these allegorical, basically parade floats of these various figures, including death and a lot of the figures that we see on the tarot cards. And each successive parade float was considered to triumph over the previous one. So the magician, or I think it was more like a mountebank, a sort of street performer, triumphs over the indigent fool, and then female pope triumphs over this street performer, and then the emperor triumphs over the female pope, and the pope is greater than the emperor. And then at some point you get out of the temporal hierarchy of temporal power in the world, and you get into the hierarchy of being. You get into love and justice and prudence, and these actually prudence isn't in there. We can talk about that. These virtues, and then beyond that you get sort of the moon and the sun, and ultimately the world, the anima mundi, the world soul, which is a Neoplatonic concept. So again, you see this idea of levels of being. So while you can't necessarily, there's no documented historical evidence that ties Tarot all the way back to Kabbalah as its origin, or to Egypt as where Tarot arose. You can see that this philosophy that came out of Egypt, this was also influential. These basic ideas, these basic precepts of Hermeticism were an important part of Italian culture at the time. This idea of hierarchy of being. And that the Tarot came out of that same tradition. And actually, to go back to Alexandria for a second, there were more Jews in Alexandria than in Palestine for some significant portion of this time when these writings were written. So Philo of Alexandria, if you see that big book over there that says Philo in really big letters, except there it is. That's Philo of Alexandria, who wrote about the Torah, but brought in these Platonic concepts. He was in Alexandria in the same time period as these Hermetic writings were being written. And actually, Kabbalah was influenced by this Hermetic milieu. These ideas went into the stream of Jewish mysticism and then arose in print around the 1100s AD in Spain and southern France. That's where Kabbalah as such began, but it was it was basically a writing down and elaboration on Jewish mystical practices that had already been going on. And many of them can be traced back to this same milieu. So let's see. But the reason that it would be difficult to tie the origins of Tarot to Kabbalah is that the first Kabbalistic texts weren't translated into Latin until 1486 by Marsilio, was it Marsilio Ficino? Or Pico? No, it was a Jew named, well, he has a few different names that are used, but Raimondo Moncada is one. And he translated it, and then Giovanni Pico della Mirandola published it. So there's these two really major figures of Renaissance Hermeticism, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino. And they worked together, and they translated a lot of these texts. Marsilio Ficino, I think, translated the Hermetic corpus. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that was he translated it in 1471. So the Hermetica and the Kabbalah weren't translated until a few decades after the first tarots that we know of. Now, it is theoretically possible that the person who originally came up with the tarot trumps was aware of Kabbalah if they were, conversant in Hebrew and had been initiated into Kabbalistic, study. But there's no evidence. There's no documentary evidence that happened. And the main evidence that's given that Kabbalah influenced the origin of tarot is the number of tarot trumps and the numbers of each of the the suits. So basically there's 22 tarot trumps, there's 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. There's 10 of each suit of cards, there's 10 sephirot on the tree of life. There's 4 court cards in each suit, there's 4 letters in the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God. Or there's 4 worlds in Hebrew Kabbalah, which we could map onto this same diagram if we wanted to. Actually, that's what Paul Foster Case maps this onto, who designed this particular tarot deck, although that symbol's been in the tarot for a long time. Where's my train of thought? Gotta jump back on it. Can somebody tell me where I was?
France.
I wasn't in France yet.
You were talking about Kabbalah paralleling the Hermeticism and how they didn't quite
Right.
meet.
So it's theoretically possible that Kabbalah did actually influence the initial development of tarot. But so that argument that just by the numbers looks good on the surface, but then when you think about it, the decad, the 10, is, you can't really, I mean, that's just as important in Western, European culture as in Jewish culture. 4
10 fingers.
is, you can find a lot of parallels for 4. And the first tarot deck that we have, there's only 19 trumps that we found. We don't know how many trumps there were. There could have been 28, there could have been 19. We know there's 19 in the deck that we have. 2 of them could have been lost, it could have been 21. And then that's the third thing. There's the way that the tarot game is played, the fool is not actually one of the trumps. It's a separate thing. So there's 21 trumps and a fool. And then at that point, you look at the number 21, it's 3 times 7. One of the authors that I was reading ties that to dice divination, where if you roll, I think it's 2 6-sided dice, there's 21 possible combinations. And there's also, the number 14 can be derived from dice. So it's not as strong an argument as it first appears. And then another reason why it's dubious to connect tarot to Kabbalah is that making symbolic images isn't necessarily a big thing that Jews do a lot of. In fact, it's prohibited in a lot of types of Judaism to make symbolic images of people to represent God. And then further, all of the tarot images, the original tarot images, can be traced much more easily to Italian culture at the time. Now, does this mean we shouldn't study tarot in conjunction with Kabbalah? No. Another principle that we could add to the Hermetic philosophy is the principle of correspondences. That things in this temporal realm that share similar qualities are actually participating in the same eternal principles. This red carpet and those red keys are red because the quality of red emanates from Mars, which is a god and also the ruler of a celestial sphere, or the intelligence of a celestial sphere. So if you're going to subdivide the universe or God into 22 equal parts, well, it obviously makes sense to correlate one system where that's done with another. In Tarot, there's 22 trumps, and in Kabbalah, there's 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. They both have to do with aspects of God, levels of being. So it makes sense to use the principle of correspondence to correlate them as a practice that can help us to ascend this ladder of being. Does that make sense? Okay, good. All right, so France. So by the time we get to Court de Ghibelline in late 18th century France, the tarot, so to kind of bridge that gap a little bit, from northern Italy, the Tarot entered France in about 1500 or 1507, when France, I don't remember the exact date, but France conquered part of northern Italy, including Milan, where the first tarots we know came from. And then tarot cards started to be printed in Marseille, France. And the Marseille pattern, it's called, is the pattern of tarot trumps that most of us are familiar with, that we're all familiar with. And it was derived from the Milanese pattern at that time. So that's the 22 trumps, or the 21 trumps and the Fool, and they're the ones that we know in pretty much the order that we know, depending on which order is in the deck that you use. We'll get into the changes of order later if we have time. So again, it's more possible that Hermetic and Kabbalistic ideas could have made their way into the Marseille deck because those things had been translated by then. But again, there's no documentary evidence that happened. Right, so tarot cards were printed in France and distributed widely, but by the time we get to Court de Ghibelline in 1781, in Paris, tarot cards were unknown. They were played in other parts of France and produced by the thousands in Marseille, but people in Paris didn't play it, they didn't know about it. And Court de Ghibelline writes this essay in his multi-volume work Le Monde Primitif, where he says that he went to a friend's house, a visiting friend from Switzerland, and she had this strange deck of cards called tarot. And he looked at the cards and immediately he knew that they came from Egypt. This isn't surprising because he knew that everything came from Egypt. He made a career out of making wild leaps from random things to Egypt. But what he may have recognized is that there is power in these symbolic images. They are sacred images that come out of the Neoplatonic Christian tradition, and and so he noticed that and said, well, if it's sacred, it must come from Egypt. And then there's another essay in that same volume of Le Monde Primitif by someone going by the title Le Comte de M. And that's been identified as Le Comte de Millay. And his essay also ties the tarot to Egypt and talks about this is the first time that tarot and the Hebrew letters have been associated in print. Now, in this book, where I'm getting a lot of this information, especially about France, they first of all argue that Court de Ghibelline's story doesn't say that this knowledge was handed down through some secret tradition. He says that he just came up with it on the spot, or he realized it on the spot. But they also point out in this book that there's some inconsistency with that story because these two essays were published using very similar ideas, but neither of them in the same publication, but neither of them acknowledged the other author. So that means that one of them must have been written first, and it would be odd for the other one not to attribute the ideas to the first one. So it's possible that they both derived the ideas from some other source, and they were both involved in, especially de Ghibelline, in secret societies and Masonic fraternities in France. So it is possible that this idea of the tarot as a sacred repository of knowledge did come out of some secret tradition, but it's unlikely that it went back through history because they didn't mention Italy. They didn't tie it to the obvious things that they would have tied it to if they knew it came from Italy. So let's see. So there's these two short essays that kind of introduce the idea of the tarot as this sacred repository of knowledge that comes from Egypt, that might be associated with Hebrew letters, but they didn't really develop it further than that. The next thinker is Jean-Baptiste Alliette, who wrote under the pseudonym of Etela, which is basically his last name reversed. And he took this idea of the Egyptian tarot and ran with it for the rest of his life. And he really developed the practice of cartomancy, of using tarot for divination. And he wrote about tarot for his entire life. He had successors who carried on this tradition, including Marie Lenormand, who derived some of her ideas from Etela, but she was a very famous diviner, soothsayer, prophetess, fortune teller, who was, these authors aren't that sympathetic to her. They kind of paint her as a shameless self-promoter, and that was her main talent, was promoting herself, which she definitely did do very well, but she probably also had some divinatory talent in order to get the kind of buzz that she was able to get. And so she also did divination for Napoleon's wife, Josephine. Yeah. But she didn't really write on the tarot. It's mentioned in her books, but she doesn't really expound a theory of how to use it or anything like that. And she also used a lot of other divinatory techniques. But she's an important part of the history of tarot because she made tarot and divination much more popular. And so during that period in France, this was the mid 1800s, early to mid 1800s. There were a lot of female diviners, female cartomancers, and it was largely considered sort of a thing that sort of wealthy ladies go do. But then one of the more important figures in French tarot occultism is Alphonse Levy, which is again a pseudonym. His name was Alphonse Louis Constant. I think all of these names and dates are on your timeline, so I'm not writing them all up. And he took all of these ideas about tarot and connected it in with all of these other streams of Western occultism. So the idea that the tarot and the Hebrew letters could be connected was there since Millay in the 1780s, but Alphonse Levy is the one who really developed a system for correlating the Kabbalah, the tarot, and then the tarot through the Kabbalah to alchemy and astrology and all of these other aspects of Western occultism. Really starting to bring it into a synthesis. And that synthesis, but it would be hard from his writings alone to actually develop a practice of Western occultism. There's a lot of tantalizing hints, but it's kind of all over the place. It's not really, it's systematic, but it's not laid out in a systematic way. So that task was done by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in England. So now we're into England. So the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was in this era in England, there was a huge efflorescence of occult societies and Masonic fraternities, and the Theosophical Society arose at this period of time in New York, but there was also connection with London from that, and these two men, Samuel Liddell Mathers and William Wynne Westcott, founded this order, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The story of how they founded it is kind of interesting, and they claim to have discovered this cipher manuscript in a book in some bookstore in London, it was a manuscript written in code, and one of them knew the cipher from some source that some earlier writer in the Western mystery tradition, and deciphered the manuscript, and it was this instructions for founding a magical order, signed by this woman, Fräulein Sprengel from Germany, and it was supposedly a Rosicrucian order. Rosicrucianism, I don't know, do you want me to go into the history of Rosicrucianism?
Yeah, give us a snapshot.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Rosicrucianism is an idea or a word really, that arose in the 16 teens in Germany. There were these two essays published, the Fama Fraternitatis and the, who knows what the other one is? If Kevin were here, he would.
There's a Rosicrucian Codex. It's not the exact name, but it's...
Yeah. Anyway, these two essays were published. They were saying we're part of this order that was founded by this guy CRC, who went and studied in Morocco and Syria and came back and founded this order and had magical powers and we're this really secret order, but now we're opening ourselves to applicants. And a whole bunch of people from around Europe publicly wrote sort of letters in various publications saying, yeah, I want to join, and then nothing happened. And then, so it's kind of this idea of this mysterious secret order that carries the ancient wisdom down to the present.
Mm-hmm.
So in Renaissance Italy, they also had this idea. They thought that Hermes was a real guy. Hermes Trismegistus was a real guy who was the teacher of Moses and Plato and everybody. And the same with Corte Ghibellin, and then the same with the Rosicrucians. It was again this idea that this secret tradition goes all the way back to the mists of time when the true wisdom was divulged to humanity.
A true Rosicrucian is never allowed to say they're a Rosicrucian.
That's kind of a paradox. So then, but a lot of orders later arose that called themselves Rosicrucian to kind of make use of the cachet of the name. I mean, I suppose it's possible that there really was a Rosicrucian fraternity and we just don't know about the people that they inducted because they were secret. I mean, that's the kind of the thing about doing history of secret societies. If they did their job, we won't have any evidence of them. So, these guys just go by the documentary evidence, which is what I'm doing mainly in this talk, because other than that, it's just theorizing. I mean, I'm not part of the secret order so I can't tell you about it. And if I were, I wouldn't tell you about it. So, so there's always the possibility of some secret transmission that didn't leave any evidence. But in order to substantiate that possibility, you would need to find knowledge that existed in the past that then there was no extant version of for a long time, that then arose later without any apparent history of transmission. Then you would know that there was a secret transmission. If it was the kind of knowledge that couldn't be derived through Gnosis, like specific symbols need to be passed down. The truths that they veil can be discovered by anybody.
So remember, half of these writings were written with blinds.
What do you mean?
They were purposely written. If you didn't know the underneath, you would not understand what was being said.
Right, yeah, so there is that possibility with a lot of them.
No, it's not a possibility, it is.
Yeah, I mean, like if you're referring to Paul Foster Case's exposition of the Rosicrucian manifestos, I don't really buy it, but there's definitely cases of that throughout history. Like alchemical writings, you can't make heads or tails of them unless you know what the symbols mean, and I don't. So, but I think there's people who've figured some of that out. All right, so they discovered this cipher manuscript. These guys say that it was probably forged. One evidence they give of that is that it quotes a text that wasn't translated at the date that it was supposedly written, or it wasn't available. It's likely was forged by a man named Kenneth Mackenzie, who was a very erudite occultist in that era of England, and William Westcott, who was one of the founders of the Golden Dawn, who discovered the manuscript, got all of Mackenzie's papers after he died. So it's possible that that's where it came from. Nobody's really sure. But there's reasons, textual reasons to believe that it didn't come from where they say it came from. Anyway, the real contribution of the Golden Dawn is that they took Alphonse Levy's writings and they created an actual system of practice. They turned it into something that you could do. They created they created ceremonies of initiation for various grades. They created a curriculum of study where you go systematically through all of these different branches of Western occultism and really synthesized all of this stuff into, again, something you can practice. Two members of, or three members of that we should mention, Arthur Edward Waite and, well, okay, so four. Arthur Edward Waite and I was going to try and do a Spanish Inquisition thing, but I don't remember. So Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith were both members of the Golden Dawn. And they together created the Waite-Smith Tarot deck, or the Rider deck, as you may know it. Rider's the publisher, Waite's the designer, Smith is the artist. And that was the first tarot deck to be published in the English-speaking world. So that was really the English-speaking world's introduction to tarot. It was this occult tarot deck that had come out of this this magical order. And then Aleister Crowley was another member of the order. He joined towards the end. So the Order of the Golden Dawn was in official operation from 1888 to 1900. In 1900, everything exploded. There was all kinds of sordid drama that you can learn about if you read the letters that were going back and forth. Basically, Mathers, one of the founders, was going crazy. He was paranoid. He was getting kind of megalomaniacal and telling people to do things that they didn't want to do. And he'd moved to France. And so people in the Golden Dawn in London were like, we don't want to follow this guy anymore. But Crowley, who was very ambitious, I mean, so one not very charitable interpretation of his actions is he basically was doing what he could to get advanced as fast as he could. Mm-hmm. So, and Mathers would do that for him, whereas the people in London didn't like him and didn't really want to advance him. So he took Mathers aside and went to London to the office and said, you know, you guys are, I don't remember exactly how it went down, but basically he tried to take control of it for Mathers, and they threw him out on the curb, and that was basically the end of the Golden Dawn. I mean, that whole fracas. But there were lots of later instantiations of the Golden Dawn that continued. And Paul Foster Case went through one of those. Now he had studied tarot from a teenager through published writings that existed, and he had a very rich inner life with tarot and the Western mysteries, including hearing a voice that would teach him things about it. And he says that he actually got a phone call from his inner voice from a guy in New York saying, "Yeah, I'm the person who's been talking to you in your head all these years. Meet me." And he went and met him, and then he founded the Builders of the Adytum, which is the order that he created, which is a correspondence order. You can sign up for it still. You pay a little bit of money every month, and then they send you the lessons that he wrote on the tarot. And he really took the Golden Dawn system of tarot and developed it as fully and deeply as anybody. Crowley went a different direction. In 1904, he received this mystical, Gnostic, Hermetic revelation, the Book of the Law, which is kind of a fusion of Golden Dawn magic and his own antinomian philosophy. Basically, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. That's the law in the Book of the Law. And he created the book of the Thoth Tarot in 1944. So the two tarot decks that are kind of the sources of all of the zillions of tarot decks that we have now are the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and the Crowley Thoth deck, which Frieda Harris painted. And then there's other ones that derive from the Tarot de Marseille, which is the older one. So that's the history in a nutshell. We could get into further details about how the order of the trumps and the letters was evolved, if you're interested in that. But why don't I conclude, and then we'll just take questions. So, we see that there is a tradition that does go back to, I didn't use this, did I? That does go back to Egypt. But it goes back to Egypt with a lot of gaps. And like I said, those gaps are good. Those gaps allow Gnosis to enter in. And so you can also notice some repeating patterns in some of the eras that we've talked about. So another set of concepts we can map onto this would be pattern. So a pattern that I've noticed looking at these different eras, there were all times when people from different cultures were coming together, or people were collecting wisdom from lots of different cultures. Times where people, and trying to synthesize it. In Alexandria, there had just been this huge empire, imperial expansion, where a lot of different territories that had been isolated somewhat from each other came under the same language and were able to share ideas. In Renaissance Italy, Greek speakers from the east were coming into Italy The rulers of these city-states were interested in knowledge and were bringing, they brought in Ramon de Moncada, this Jew from Spain, and they were interested in bringing all this knowledge together. And that was also a period of sort of empire where these city-states had trading empires. They didn't necessarily have. So basically, there's this resemblance between all of these periods. 19th century England, same thing. Turn of the century England, a huge empire bringing a lot of knowledge. Right now, same thing. The American empire is a global empire. We're sucking up all the knowledge we can from all over the universe, or the world, not only, well, the universe. We got the Hubble Space Telescope, and through the internet, bringing it all to everybody. So, we have this theory of history that the point closest to eternity is the past, and the idea that the point closest to eternity is the future. I think both of those have some validity as well. Ideas that arose in the past and are still around today are probably around because they have some element of eternal truth to them. The more time goes on, the more of eternity can get into the present. So the more presents there are for eternity to come in, so the more knowledge there can be. And the present, without us in the present connecting to Gnosis, there's no wisdom to pass on. Without somebody in the present and the past doing that, there will be no wisdom that's been passed on. So another way of looking at it is that all points in time are equidistant from eternity. And if all points on a line are equidistant from a single point, what do you get? Circle. So another symbol that we could use to represent history would be the circle. And that's where we get the cycles of history that we notice, and the cycles of the day and the cycle of the year. I'm not saying one of these is more correct than the other. They're just two different ways, two different doorways into understanding. And to be truly Hermetic, each of you can go home and contemplate. How would you synthesize these two images, these two ideas of history? So I would say that all religions, all symbolic systems contain expressions of this eternal truth. But this truth is infinite. It can't be grasped by any individual, any culture, any civilization. No finite revelation can be the final revelation. Revelation is continuous. Because what's being revealed is infinite. So we could understand history as the process of that truth being articulated, one event or one letter at a time. And perhaps that is the book of Thoth. It's the revelation of Thoth through the events of history. So we're writing that book right now, and for the rest of our lives. The book of Thoth is history itself, cosmological, geological, and anthropological, and what we're living right now. Do you like that story? Cool. But the point of this talk is not that you go out and tell this story. It's that you try out the process that I used to come up with it. It's that you find the symbolic expression that speaks to you, whether it's tarot or another one, and engage in this process of, movement towards the center or towards the above, and come up with your own gnosis. And so the tarot is a good tool for that.